I'm back.
There was a stretch in the early 80s when a perfectly normal split-level house in the suburbs could turn out to be the most frightening set in Hollywood. The house belonged to Poltergeist, released by MGM on June 4th, 1982, exactly 1 week before E.T. the Extraterrestrial hit theaters. The credits say Tobe Hooper directed it. They also say Steven Spielberg produced it, wrote the story, and co-wrote the screenplay. Decades later, film historians, journalists, and the people who were actually on set still can't agree on where Hooper's job ended and Spielberg's began, and we'll dig into exactly why later in this video. The film starred Craig T. Nelson as Steve Freeling, a real estate agent who sells suburban dream homes without ever reading the fine print on his own. JoBeth Williams played his wife, Diane, who spends much of the back half of the movie fighting to get her youngest daughter back from the other side. Heather O'Rourke played 5-year-old Carol, and the one member of the Freeling family the ghosts actually want to talk to. And Zelda Rubinstein arrived 2/3 of the way through as Tangina, the diminutive medium who instantly becomes the most commanding presence in the film. Here are 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally unsettling facts about how Poltergeist actually got made. Stick around for the final one, because it involves a scene that has terrified audiences for more than 40 years, and the truth about who is actually in it has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Before she became a star in her own right, a young Drew Barrymore read for the part of Carol and Freeling during casting in 1981. She was seriously considered, but Spielberg had a very particular image in his head of what the character should look like and sound like, and he ended up finding her in the least glamorous way imaginable. 5-year-old Heather O'Rourke was having lunch with her mother in the MGM commissary, while her older sister worked on the set of Pennies from Heaven nearby. Spielberg noticed her, walked over, and asked if the family would bring her in to read. Her first audition reportedly flopped. Someone handed her a stuffed toy hoping to provoke a scream, and got a fit of giggles instead. So the crew tried a different approach. They read her a scary story and asked her to scream on cue. And this time she screamed so hard she began to cry. That was the reaction they were looking for, and Carol had her face. As for Barrymore, she didn't leave empty-handed. Spielberg had another project waiting in the wings, a family science fiction film about a stranded alien, and he cast her as Gertie, the role that helped launch her career. When Spielberg first started developing Poltergeist, he reportedly reached out to the biggest name in horror fiction at the time, Stephen King, hoping the two might collaborate on the script. King was interested, but he was in the middle of an ocean crossing to England by ship, long before cell phones or reliable satellite communication made reaching someone mid-voyage simple. By the time word got back to Spielberg, the production had already moved forward with screenwriters Michael Grays and Mark Victor. The two men have told this story consistently over the years, without placing blame on anyone involved. It was simply a matter of timing and a slow boat. King and Spielberg never did end up collaborating directly on a film, although Spielberg later purchased the film rights to King's novel, The Talisman, and has mentioned on and off for years that he'd still like to adapt it. One of the film's most stomach-turning sequences shows Diane Freeling being pulled into a flooded, half-dug swimming pool and surfacing surrounded by skeletons rising out of the mud. Those skeletons weren't studio props built from scratch. According to accounts from the effects team, they were purchased from a medical supply catalog, the same kind of skeletons used in classrooms and anatomy labs, because in the early 1980s, genuine human remains were reportedly cheaper to acquire than convincing artificial ones. The effects crew then sculpted decayed flesh and foam rubber detailing directly onto the real bones to make them look suitably horrifying for the camera. JoBeth Williams spent several days shooting in that muddy pool surrounded by them, and by her own account, she had no idea at the time that they weren't fake. She only found out the truth years later from a member of the effects team, who told her, quite plainly, that nobody had built them. The image of Robbie Freeling's clown doll dragging him under the bed is one of the most enduring nightmare-fuel moments of 80s cinema, and it's often credited with giving an entire generation a fear of clowns. Oliver Robbins, who played Robbie, was only about 10 years old when the scene was filmed, and because there was no digital effects work available, he had to physically wrestle a life-sized mechanical clown prop on camera. During the strangling portion of the scene, Accounts describe the puppet's arms tightening around his throat more than intended, and Robbins reportedly began struggling to breathe. For a moment, it's said that the crew assumed he was simply acting, until it became clear something was actually wrong and the scene was stopped. Robbins himself has said in later interviews that he doesn't personally remember the incident happening, even though he's heard the story told many times, and has speculated that he may have briefly blacked out during the take. The scene where Marty hallucinates that he's tearing the flesh off his own face in a bathroom mirror is arguably the single most talked about image from the entire film. It wasn't part of the original screenplay. According to testimony given years later during litigation surrounding the film, the idea was developed on the spot by makeup effects artist Michael McCracken, while the crew was already busy filming other effects sequences for the same scene. McCracken received his standard effects credit on the picture, but the specific creative idea for that moment has never been formally attributed to him in the film's official credit list, even though sworn testimony confirms it was his. Before the haunting turns violent, the film pauses for a quiet, comedic scene where Steve and Diane share a joint in bed after putting the kids down for the night. Nelson and Williams weren't smoking anything illegal for the shoot. The joints were reportedly rolled with oregano. Nelson, a former stand-up comedian and comedy writer, has said that much of the scene's dialogue and physical comedy, including a bit where he repeatedly sucks in and releases his stomach, was largely improvised rather than scripted. Williams has said the material had her laughing so hard during filming that after enough takes, the two of them genuinely started to feel a little loopy, even though there was nothing in the cigarettes but dried herbs. In later interviews, Spielberg described Poltergeist as something close to autobiography, at least emotionally. He's named a clown doll, a bedroom closet, the vague fear of something under the bed, and a tree outside his childhood window in New Jersey that seemed to reach toward the house whenever the wind picked up, as the direct inspirations for specific scares in the film. The project itself only came together because an earlier one fell apart. After Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Spielberg had been developing a film called Night Skies, about a family under siege by hostile extraterrestrials, with writer John Sayles attached to the script. When he brought the concept to Tobe Hooper, Hooper wasn't interested in aliens. He wanted a ghost story instead. The alien concept was eventually reworked by writer Melissa Matheson into what became E.T., while the ghost story became Poltergeist. The two films opened 1 week apart in the summer of 1982. Screenwriter Richard Matheson, a major figure in genre fiction, wrote a Twilight Zone episode in 1962 called Little Girl Lost, about a young girl who slips through her bedroom wall into another dimension. Her parents can hear her calling out, but can't see or reach her, and the episode ends with a parent crossing over to bring her back. Matheson has said the idea came to him after his own daughter rolled under her bed at home, and he could hear her, but briefly couldn't find her. Spielberg grew up watching The Twilight Zone, and by Matheson's own account, had asked to borrow a copy of that specific episode years before Poltergeist went into production. Matheson also noted that the parapsychologists who show up with scientific equipment to investigate the haunting closely echo elements of his own novel Hell House. Despite the overlap, Matheson never pursued legal action and has spoken about the connection with more amusement than resentment, and the two continued to work together afterward, including on the anthology series Amazing Stories. Long before she told a 5-year-old not to go into the light, Zelda Rubinstein worked in a blood bank and held a background in bacteriology, spending years as a medical laboratory technician. She didn't pursue acting until her 40s, when she decided she wanted to try something more creative and enrolled in an acting class. Her first film role was a small part in the 1981 comedy Under the Rainbow, which is what put her on the radar for Poltergeist. The role of Tangina had reportedly been written specifically for a short-stature performer, with Spielberg wanting to make the point that physical size had nothing to do with the character's authority or power. Rubinstein filmed all of her scenes in the movie in roughly 6 days and walked away with some of the strongest reviews of the entire cast, including praise from prominent film critics who singled her out by name as the film's most compelling performer. Shortly before Poltergeist opened in theaters, the Los Angeles Times published a piece asking directly who had actually directed the movie, Tobe Hooper or Steven Spielberg. In the article, Spielberg was quoted describing Hooper as someone who wasn't naturally inclined to take charge on set, while co-producer Frank Marshall was quoted saying that Spielberg had been the creative force behind the picture and had personally designed every storyboard, while also noting Hooper was present on set every day. The Directors Guild of America opened a formal inquiry into whether Hooper's directing credit had been undermined. Hooper kept his official credit, but the Guild determined that MGM's marketing had leaned too heavily on Spielberg's name and fined the studio. Just before the film's release, Spielberg wrote an open letter defending Hooper and blaming the press for misrepresenting their working relationship. To this day, people involved in the production have offered conflicting accounts of exactly how creative control was split between the two men. Not long after Poltergeist became a box office hit, writer Paul Clemens and his writing partner Bennett Michael Yellen filed a lawsuit seeking tens of millions of dollars, alleging that the film's premise had been lifted from a treatment they had written called Housebound. The treatment, which the pair had registered with the Writers Guild years earlier, involved a family in a strange house that swallows their youngest daughter, with her voice calling out from somewhere inside the walls. Their attorneys claimed dozens of specific similarities between the treatment and the finished film. Spielberg's side maintained the treatment had never actually reached his office, and because no one could conclusively prove it had been delivered, a judge ruled the evidence wasn't strong enough to proceed to a jury trial. The case was settled just days before it would have gone to trial. One unexpected side effect of that lawsuit is that it forced several members of the production, under oath, to publicly detail exactly how many of the film's most talked about elements, including who came up with the face-ripping scene and where those pool skeletons really came from, actually happened. When Poltergeist was first submitted to the ratings board, it received an R rating. According to reports at the time, the board's chairman clarified that the R wasn't for graphic content, but for the sheer intensity of the experience, specifically citing how the Dolby sound mix immersed audiences inside the film's tension. MGM had marketed the movie toward a teenage audience and appealed the rating, and the appeals board ultimately voted to lower it to PG, without a single frame being cut or altered. That wasn't the film's only ratings controversy. A local Texas film classification board attempted to block the movie from local theaters the day before release, arguing it wasn't appropriate for anyone under 16. MGM ignored the objection and kept the film running. During the resulting hearing, one juror reportedly compared the film's face-ripping sequence to a similarly intense moment in another Spielberg-connected film that had already been approved for a PG rating, and the objection was dropped. 2 years later, the controversy surrounding Poltergeist, along with a couple of other films of the era, contributed directly to the MPAA creating the PG-13 rating. Over the years, a persistent urban legend has claimed that the Poltergeist trilogy was cursed, pointing to the deaths of 4 people connected to the films over a 6-year period. The people closest to those individuals have spent decades clarifying what actually happened. Dominique Dunne, who played the eldest Freeling daughter in the first film, was 22 when she was killed by an ex-boyfriend later that same year. He was convicted of manslaughter. Julian Beck, who appeared in the second film, died of stomach cancer in 1985 at the age of 60, and had already been diagnosed with the illness before he took the role. Will Sampson, also from the second film, died in 1987 following complications from surgery related to a long-term degenerative illness. And Heather O'Rourke passed away in 1988 at the age of 12, after being misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease, when she actually had a congenital intestinal defect that went undetected until it was too late. For tragedies, each with a distinct and well-documented medical or criminal explanation, and none connected to the production itself. Effects artist Craig Reardon, whose props are frequently blamed by curse theorists, has publicly said he doesn't believe in the idea and finds it uncomfortable that people attach his work to the real grief of real families. For the film's climactic sequence, the Freeling house needed to collapse in on itself and disappear entirely. Industrial Light and Magic built a highly detailed miniature version of the house, roughly 6 feet across, complete down to individual shingles, and mounted it vertically. Cameras filmed from above at a very high frame rate to allow the destruction to be slowed down smoothly in the final cut, while steel cables ran through the model to pull it apart on cue, and a vacuum system beneath the set pulled debris downward and out of frame, giving the impression that the house was being swallowed rather than simply falling apart. There was no backup model. The entire miniature was destroyed in roughly 2 seconds during its one and only take, meaning months of meticulous model building work existed for a single irreplaceable shot. According to accounts from the crew, the effect was so convincing that during the first screening of the finished footage, a projectionist who had seen countless films before reacted out loud from the booth, and Spielberg reportedly heard it from his seat and knew immediately that the shot had worked. We've already covered the fact that the face-ripping bathroom mirror scene wasn't in the original script and was improvised on set by the effects team. But there's a second detail about that scene that's gone largely unnoticed for decades. Audiences have long assumed that the hand seen tearing into the character's face on screen belonged to actor Martin Casella, who played Marty. They didn't. The effects team had only built a single detailed likeness of Casella's head for the close-up shot. There was no second version to work with. And when it came time to actually perform the gruesome close-up destruction of that face, it was Spielberg himself who stepped into frame and did it, reportedly even borrowing Casella's watch and ring beforehand, so the hands would visually match. By Casella's own account, he found the whole thing thrilling to watch happen. So after everything, the newspaper questioning who really directed this film, the Guild inquiry, the lawsuit, 4 decades of debate over how much of Poltergeist actually belongs to Steven Spielberg. There's one piece of evidence that settles at least part of the argument, and it's been sitting in plain sight in every single copy of the film since 1982. The most disturbing image in the movie is, quite literally, Steven Spielberg's own hands. And that's 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally unsettling facts about how Poltergeist came together. Which one caught you off guard? Let us know down in the comments. And if you've ever hesitated walking past an unfinished swimming pool because of this movie, you're not alone.